Good afternoon. Welcome back. Just transition. We heard this term at the opening. We heard this term during the remarks this morning. We've heard it again this afternoon. What does it mean? What are we talking about? Thank you for joining us for our last session of the day, Cobalt's role in transitioning to a net zero world in a right, respectful manner, aka the just transition. My name is Anna Triponel. I'm a business and human rights advisor and founder at Hugman. I'll be your moderator for today, but I'll be joined by some fabulous speakers. But before I introduce them, a few framing remarks. We all know that the transition to a net zero world is urgent. The World Meteorological Organization just said last week, we have a 48% chance, that's half, 50% chance, of reaching 1.5 degrees in the next 5 years. Anyone who has read the IPCC's last report, 1.5 degrees warming, knows that 1.5 degrees is a really, really challenging place to be as compared to the 1.1 degrees we're in today. We also know that Cobalt plays a critical role in this transition to a net zero world. We just heard this morning that for the first time in history, last year, the use of cobalt in electric vehicles has surpassed all other uses, phones, computers, superalloys, etc. So it is critical that we talk about the transition, and we talk about it now, and we talk about the people at the heart of it. So people are talking about the just transition. What does this term mean? What does it encompass? What does it mean for the cobalt sector? What we'll be doing today is we'll be hearing from 3 external speakers to help us think through how the external world views the just transition. We will hear from the PRI, Bettina Reinboth, Director of Human Rights and Social Issues, to give us a keynote from her perspective, from the investor's perspective. Then we will hear from Hayley St. Denis, who is a Just Transition lead at the Institute for Human Rights and Business, who'll delve further into the concept and provide us with some more flavor about what it means. And then we'll delve into, in concrete terms, what does it mean for companies? And this will be by Charlotte Hugman, who is lead researcher at Climate and Energy at the World Benchmarking Alliance. So that'll be a bit more of online. I know you're used to that with the last 2 years, but then we will go into in-person discussion. I'll invite up my speakers here and I'll introduce them at that point. But for now, let us hand over to Bettina.
Thank you very much, Anna, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much for this invitation to share some reflections on the topic of just transition. It's a pleasure to be here, even though it's still virtual and not in person. So I'm a little bit jealous of you all sitting in person together. As Anna said, my name is Bettina Reinboth, and I'm the Director of Human Rights and Social Issues at the PRI, Principles for Responsible Investment, which is the world's leading proponent of responsible investment, with now more than 4,000 global investor signatories, so institutional investors, who have all signed up to our principles and together represent more than $100 trillion in assets under management, so quite a big chunk of the capital markets. The concept of just transition is a key pillar of the 2015 Paris Agreement that really merges social inclusion with climate action to ensure that the shift to a resilient, zero carbon economy is both fair and puts people at its heart. In fact, just transition is almost a precondition of successful climate action. Without the buy-in of all stakeholders, including workers and communities, there will be pushback, something we've definitely seen with the Gilets jaunes, or the yellow vest movement in France a few years ago. And for years now, climate change has topped investors' agenda when it comes to ESG issues. As they increasingly seek to address climate change within their investments, it's critical to remember that the climate change is as much of a social issue as it is an environmental one. A just transition has also become quite a trendy term in the investment community, especially on the back of COP26 last year. And we've seen investor awareness and support of the just transition concept is just increasing and growing. Today, actually, over 161 global investors with more than $10.2 trillion of assets under management have all signed up to an international statement committing their support to this agenda. And over 60 investors globally have all actually been part of a PRI investor working group on just transition, working on taking this concept from theory to practice. However, there seems to have been a strong focus on the just transition out. So with interim investor net zero targets on the horizon, investors are facing pressure to accelerate their plans and focus on decarbonizing portfolios. In other words, transitioning out of a low carbon economy. However, it is crucial to also consider what it means to transition in. And as we're all faced with the urgency of tackling the climate emergency, as Anna nicely put out in her framing remarks, there is increasing pressure for the mining sector to focus on transition minerals. And as you're all aware, cobalt is critical to the transition towards a low carbon economy, and the demand is expected to soar over the coming years. So it needs to also be a just transition into renewables, which ensures jobs are decent and not just green, and also have the safeguards in place to ensure that workers and communities are treated fairly and are benefiting from the much needed transition. So why is it a topic increasingly on the investor agenda? Investors that we've seen are increasingly thinking of the interconnectedness of these two pressing agendas, climate change and the climate emergency, but also the social implications and the human rights agenda. And this means understanding which stakeholders need to be involved in setting up climate action strategies, both for companies and for investors. Worker representatives, communities, and consumers all need to be consulted, as well as beneficiaries of big pension funds must have their say as well, as this is crucial in making sure that everyone is on board so that the climate action is not hampered or stopped. And by aligning with the just transition, investors broaden their understanding of systemic risks. They reinvigorate fiduciary duty, recognize material value drivers, and also uncover investment opportunities, all doing so while contributing to wider societal goals. And by adopting a deliberate approach to support the just transition, investors can also honor their responsibility to respect global human and labor rights in line with the ILO guidelines for just transition and the UN guiding principles of business and human rights. In reality, much of investors' impact takes place through others. Firstly, through capital allocation. They finance companies whose projects and actions have a direct impact on the world. Secondly, through stewardship activities with those companies and other investees, where they can help steer the impact and make sure through corporate engagement and engaging with companies that this is becoming much more of a center stage. And finally, also through engagement and advocacy with policymakers and stakeholders around the world, they can help kind of shape key regulations, structures, and more. So what are some of the expectations we see from investors to companies? Net zero commitments are all multiplying, both on corporate and investor fronts, and they need to have a strong social component from the get-go. Or we're going to have a lot of issues trying to mitigate or remedy the unintended social implications that these commitments will bring along. And here I'm thinking, for example, on negative human rights impacts of renewable energy companies on communities, as we're seeing that this is a very quick move and very fast one, if not everyone is consulted with it. Also clearly articulating and identifying and ensuring the minimum safeguards that are in place, which are paramount to ensuring decent work in the low carbon economy. I mentioned earlier, green jobs aren't necessarily decent jobs. So it's fundamental to ensure that the jobs we're talking about in the renewables and cobalt sectors, as we're transitioning in, are also being fair and decent. And as we know, investors need the right data. It's always a question that comes up. And there are some actually positive developments on this front. For example, through the Climate Action 100 Plus collective engagement and stewardship initiative, where investors are engaging with the top 100 global emitters on their climate change and transition plans. There's a just transition indicator that's been fleshed out much more to more meaningfully capture the performance of these companies being assessed, as well as also the work of the World Benchmarking Alliance around their just transition assessments, which you'll be very lucky to hear more about after my speech as well. And we're also seeing examples of successful engagement between investors and investee companies. For example, there's a group led by an asset manager that engaged with the UK SSE on just transition, and the release last year the company's just transition strategy. So also through those conversations and stewardship activities, companies are starting to refine their strategies. And if we turn to the Cobalt sector specifically, there's some clear expectations from investors that were developed through an investor collaborative engagement initiative that PRI was engaging for a few years, that focused more on child labor and human rights risks in the Cobalt supply chain. But I think they become very relevant in light also of the just transition discussion. Investors are engaging on core issues and challenges associated with cobalt sourcing, have clear expectations for companies to address the variety of risks associated with both artisanal and large-scale mining, to address these risks through strong due diligence, continually monitoring potential and actual adverse impacts, and addressing them when identified. Investors also expect greater disclosure from companies around their commitment to responsible sourcing cobalt and how they plan to do it, and also prioritization of risk mitigation over risk avoidance. Risk avoidance doesn't necessarily mean that that's risk mitigation. And I think investors, this is a point that investors have also highlighted and are very concerned that companies who've stopped sourcing from artisanal or small scale mines, for example, permanently, may have also negative effects on the livelihoods of local communities. So really understanding kind of the full spectrum of risks and issues. And really also calling for a deeper and strengthened stakeholder engagement. And investors continue to signal to companies and to the broader range of stakeholders that they are committed to seeing improvements in human rights due diligence efforts, risk mitigation, and the remedy of any negative impacts. So while there are encouraging developments, the just transition and agenda, expectations develop continuously on all fronts. And we also need to see more investor action across the different levers and tools that investors themselves have at their disposal, as well as also more place-based initiatives. Just transition plays out very differently in different contexts. You know, what does a just transition look like in Canada versus in the DRC or somewhere else? And also more collaboration with other actors, including governments and also other entities in the financial sector. And we need to see greater and more meaningful engagement with affected stakeholders and their representatives. That means workers and unions and affected communities and civil societies and consumer groups. And to be meaningful, this stakeholder engagement must also inform the design of the strategy and be continued throughout the implementation and delivery of the strategy to make sure it's fit for purpose. So finally, the net zero transition is already underway, but the pace of change, both from a social and environmental perspective, is far too limited and much too slow. And the critical agenda simply will not be achieved in time without a whole of the economy-wide response, which includes private sector action alongside government policy. And at the PRI, we believe investors' leverage and agency really enables them to shape outcomes in the world, and that their investments have both a positive and a negative impact. And in placing the just transition at the center of their climate strategies, have the power to then significantly accelerate progress toward a more better and more equal future for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bettina. So really, I like the way Bettina has reminded us that this trendy term, she calls it, so the buzzword, it really has become the term, especially since COP26. And Bettina mentioned the numbers here, 161 global investors with 10.2 trillion of assets under management. It's a big figure of investors really behind this. And just the SSC strategy, very quickly, for those who don't know, SSC is the first company to have come out with a just transition strategy. They operate off the North Sea, off of Scotland. And they said just last week on a panel, our investors were fundamentally, you know, the key drivers in helping us look at this. So thank you, Bettina. Let's move to Hayley from the Institute for Human Rights and Business to go through in a bit more specificity. What are we talking about here?
Thanks, Anna. I hope you can hear me well.
We can hear you, but we can't see you.
Ooh.
All right, we can see your slides, but we can't see you.
Interesting, okay. Hopefully AV can help with that as I go along.
We can see Bettina, but we'll leave it in the tech's hands.
Okay, I'll just get started. I'm sure they'll sort. So thank you very much for having me. My name is Haley St. Denis, and I'm with the Institute for Human Rights and Business. We're a nonprofit, think and do tank, we like to say. We try to be very thoughtful about our role. We're not activists, but we're not corporate cheerleaders. We're critical friends. We share our research as public goods, built on trust and dialogue with business, government, and civil society. And so today I'll try to give a sort of big picture overview of what just transitions are. We're only going to be scratching the surface really, but if I can get you interested and excited, that's a very good outcome for me. And in terms of my message today, what I'll reiterate throughout, and what I want to leave you thinking is that the train is leaving the station. So the task ahead of us is one of decarbonizing to build a cleaner, greener world, but while we're at it, a fairer one as well. And even before COVID, numerous intergovernmental reports showed that the most corrosive impacts within and between economies was growing inequality. So we're living in a deeply unequal world as well as an overcarbonized one. And those things together put justice right at the heart of the economic transitions needed to achieve net zero. So transitions will rightly start with energy and energy use, but no sector will be unaffected. And that especially includes sectors like yours within the transition to a low carbon economy. And so in terms of what just transitions are, it has been defined over the years in a variety of ways, from like for like energy replacement to approaches integrating procedural and distributive justice for more structural reform, all the way through to really transformative approaches that envision a complete overhaul of the political and economic systems that are really seen as driving the climate and inequality crises. So as we've already heard from Bettina and from Anna, we're at this point where there's tremendous uptake of a very visionary concept, but not yet with a really single definition. And so until there are clearer norms and standards around it, from my perspective, it's best to think of it as a pathway, to first think really ambitiously about the outcomes we're collectively targeting: low or zero emissions, guaranteed social protection, decent work for all, poverty elimination, and thriving and resilient communities. And then work backward from that to chart your path as a company, as part of a wider ecosystem of actors as well, and what that path should be to make the concept of justice within this conversation real. And so just to dial into a little more specificity, there's 6 points summarized on the screen that I would consider essential elements to think about. Context, a risk to people approach, not limiting your focus only to workers, ensuring your planning is integrated as well as holistic, and sharing your learnings. So first on context, every transition is going to be multidimensional. Transitions will be happening at different times, at different levels, and at different rates, requiring action from a concert of different actors. And so just transitions is really a contested space, and it should be, because every transition is going to have local history and politics forming the backdrop. So it is all about practice on the ground. No one is looking for more lofty commitments or nice words on paper. We really want to see the hard, quiet work on the ground of trust building with potentially affected stakeholders. Really asking yourselves the question constantly, what it means for those stakeholders to have agency in the decision-making processes that are going to transform their lives. Second, preventing risks is an essential first step. And we've already heard this a little bit throughout the day. Just transitions is not just a matter of creating new jobs or ad hoc local programs. First and foremost, a risk to people approach must be embedded deeply into your company culture, systems, and relationships. And the UN guiding principles are the established global baseline here. So the bottom line is, unless you continually assess your risks, your involvement, and take appropriate action, we're just trading one crisis for another. Climate action for social breakdown. And that includes subcontracting. It does not cancel out your human rights risks. It's not someone else's problem. It only changes the way in which you're involved in impacts. Third, and very related, make sure that you're taking a holistic approach to how you look at stakeholders. Just transitions has been pioneered over the years and decades by the trade union movement. So workers are a fundamental group that stands to lose or gain a great deal depending how companies and governments choose to transition. But there are also many other stakeholders at risk, and communities and consumers must be central as you make your plans. Fourth, full spectrum transition. We've already heard that this is not just a transition out of coal problem. The transition in is very much the other half of the transition coin. IHRB's patron, Mary Robinson, just issued a few days ago a very direct call to action to the transition mineral industry. So I really encourage you to read her remarks in Project Syndicate. The bottom line there is that doing well on cobalt, already a tall order in human rights terms, doesn't mean the impacts on other commodities you're involved with are somehow less. So it's also that holistic approach across all commodities. Fifth, planning is everything. In the mining sector, this really means a life cycle approach to planning. So closure needs to be planned in from the start. Selling off assets to less responsible companies, defer, divest, these are major targets for scrutiny and backlash that are only going to grow. And a related area also drawing economists, academics, policymakers' focus is previously abandoned assets and the social remedies needed to make those right to host communities and to workers. So finally, in terms of essential elements, we are all very much just learning together what just transitions means, and no one actor is going to be able to do this alone. So share your learnings fully and frankly. Emotions are high right now. Climate impacts are happening all over. Communities are not benefiting from the economic transitions happening on their doorstep. And we're operating in a world of very low trust. So addressing information asymmetries is really going to be essential to repairing that, and will pay dividends not just to those groups, but to your company as well. This next slide is sort of intentionally messy to really kind of encapsulate the tremendous global uptake that we're seeing in terms of this concept. And I won't try to summarize all of these, you can find them all online, but we are really starting to see a lot of pickup at the government level to establish national and local just transitions plans. Investors and banks' own net zero commitments are facing major scrutiny, and many other companies across the transition out and the transition in are already communicating how they're understanding their role on just transitions. So lastly, just looking ahead, I'll sort of close by saying that this disruption is necessarily going to destabilize everything. And we don't yet have a coherence of approach across the ecosystem of actors that are at the center of this. Governments are at very different levels of maturity on just transitions. Companies are at the start of internalizing how they'll manage them. So from the IHRB perspective, guardrails are very much needed around what are currently all voluntary commitments to ensure we can have the confidence in them while we wait for governments to catch up and regulate and the international system to govern. We need confidence to know where we are on the journey so that we know how much more ambition is needed. And we need integrity to be at the heart of what it means to be on a transition pathway. There have been a rush of net zero claims, and in those claims have to be questions of justice, of rights, and of social dimensions of the journey. Can you make a net zero claim and be considered worthy or investable if it doesn't also relate to your company's commitment on free, prior, and informed consent or decent work? These are the kinds of questions IHRB will certainly be looking at in the time ahead. At this need for coherence, for norms and standards, we will be conducting inquiries informed by real-time transitions on the ground and trying to draw lessons globally across sectors and across the sort of supply, demand, and financing dimensions of just transitions. And we would absolutely welcome your engagement on that work. I'll leave it there, Anna. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hayley. So much rich content there. I'll just pull out one nugget of the wisdom that I think is really timely for today, which is that we have the just transition as a visionary concept, but no clear definition. So there really is an opportunity here to shape it as a sector with a pathway and with some guardrails. So what does it look like if we are going to try and translate this into practice and evaluate companies against it? Let's hear from Charlotte from the World Benchmarking Alliance.
Hi there. Thank you so much for inviting us to speak today. It's a great opportunity for us as the World Benchmarking Alliance, or WBA, as we're known to, indeed, as Anna says, just give an overview today, really, of how we've tried to capture what companies should be doing in order to contribute to a just transition. So I'm here to present our methodology, the 6 indicators we've developed in consultation with many stakeholders, and how we've used those to assess some companies last year and presented those results at COP26 to increase accountability around just transition. So firstly, just very quickly, I wanted to introduce who we are and where we fit in to this landscape. We are a global organization, and we develop free and publicly available benchmarks, that is rankings of companies that are intended to measure and compare their performance towards the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. And our work is really designed to equip multiple stakeholders, so investors, governments, civil society, individuals, and importantly, the companies, with the information they need to engage on these issues and to step up where needed. So to structure this work, we identified what we call 7 system transformations that we see that will be needed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 as targeted. And these 7 systems are overlapping, so they represent and recognise the interconnected and interdependent nature of the various sustainability topics covered by the goals. And our aim is to benchmark 2,000 of the world's most influential companies across these 7 areas by 2023. And we call these companies keystone. So we see that they have the power to influence and really cause systemic change across the 7 areas, thus following from that, achieving sustainable development. So this slide is intended to really present where then drilling down into our just transition work that sits in our work so far. And we've heard from Bettina and Hayley around the goals and the Paris Agreement in particular. I think in terms of relating to just transition, and it's notable from the beginning of our work as well, of course, that just transition is really enshrined in the Paris Agreement. So to achieve the Paris Agreement, we need a just transition. And then various of the Sustainable Development Goals also relate to what we see as the outcomes of a just transition, so decent work being a prime example of one of those goals. And we heard as well from Bettina, I think really clearly around the established, I think, recognition that decarbonisation of our economy will only succeed if it also includes protection and solutions for those workers, communities and other affected stakeholders who are obviously very much at the heart of this transition to low carbon. So we've developed our methodology, as I mentioned, it has 6 areas, in partnership and consultation with more than 20 organisations, both within and beyond our alliance. And our alliance is a really important feature of our work as the WBA. And in fact, it gives me great honour to mention that Bettina's organisation PRI and Hayley's organisation, the IHRB, are both allies within the WBA network of over 300 allies. So we have tried to really pull together and capture the best sort of current views and practices in developing our methodology. And we did this last year and then piloted it by using it to assess 180 companies, so 30 automotive manufacturers, 50 electric utilities, and 100 oil and gas keystone, as I mentioned, companies. And those results are available online. I'll touch on some of them in a few moments. But to give recognition to the integrated nature of companies' contributions of the social impacts of the low carbon transition in their actual low carbon transition from 2022 onwards, we are integrating these just transition indicators into the assessments that we do across what we call our climate and energy benchmark, which has already been running for a couple of years, looking at companies' alignment and their emissions pathways to reach the Paris Agreement. From this year, we're now going to integrate the scores on social and just transition. So wanting to dive a little bit more into the nitty-gritty here and how did we develop the indicators? And I think also indeed echoing the previous 2 speakers on really how we've grounded these in international norms and standards, but also complementing those, the use of those international norms and standards. So very importantly, not reinventing the wheel, but but grounding our indicators in the UN guiding principles and other relevant UN conventions and covenants, as well as International Labour Organization, ILO conventions, and relevant OECD guidelines and conventions, as well as corporate reporting frameworks, disclosure initiatives, and relevant benchmarks in the space. And we undertake, as we always do as WBA, in developing methodologies to assess companies, global stakeholder consultations through multiple media, so online technical surveys, bilateral conversations, multi-stakeholder roundtables as well, including with the investor group mentioned earlier, as well as other civil society organisations and companies themselves. And to support us in that work, the IHRB, amongst others, formed our Just Transition Advisory Group. So we also had representatives who have worked on business guidance in the past, so the B team and BSR, as well as the Just Transition Centre of the ITUC, and the others that you see here on the slide. And it's also, I think, of note that we've worked together with members of the team that input into the CA 100 plus net zero company benchmark as well. So really seeking to converge where possible, so that we can give as much clarity as possible to companies on what they should be contributing to a just transition. So the results of the indicator development and what we then put into practice in our pilot assessment last year are these 6 indicators you see on the screen here. And these are really drawing together and I think giving that granularity to things mentioned by both Hayley and Bettina already today. So the fundamental first steps, let's say, so indicators 1 and 2, assess companies on whether they are committing to and engaging in real social dialogue with workers and unions and broader stakeholder engagement in order to inform part 2, which is then having a plan for just transition that includes time-bound and measurable targets, how the company will contribute to mitigating and accounting for those social impacts on workers, communities, and other affected stakeholders. Then 3 and 4 are kind of the doing part and really, I think, speak a lot to the kind of transition in piece as well. So not just looking at exiting the high carbon, high emitting activities, but entering into then the low carbon business activities of the future. So are companies creating green and decent jobs? Are these inclusive? Do they embed equality of opportunity as well? And how are companies assessing where they need to or upskill workers, and how can they work on retaining workers and the communities around them as well, people within those communities who they employ? And then finally, around the broader ecosystem, looking at indicators 5 and 6 and seeing whether companies are contributing to social protection mechanisms. This begins, and I'll speak to a second about the kind of fundamentals that underpin these questions that we ask as well around, are companies paying taxes fairly and ethically, practicing support for social protection? And then finally, are they advocating for policies and regulation supporting a just transition? And these questions that we ask of companies, we gather data on them, we ask the companies to input data if they can. These 6 questions on just transition go hand in hand with our fundamentals on social impact and assessing that as well. And you see on the right hand side of this slide what we also look at for all companies across our 2,000 that we cover. So are they providing and promoting decent work? Are they respecting human rights? And are they acting ethically? And as I mentioned, the payment of fair taxes there relates to social protection for a just transition. So just to emphasize all of our work, the methodology in particular is free and publicly available. I've added a link in this slide, and I believe the slides will be shared after this talk. So please do feel free to explore that and reach out to us with any questions. But I just wanted to take a moment to then look ahead in terms of what our results found last year and how we seek to move forward in enhancing accountability and shared understanding for business across just transition. So this is a nascent area, and we did find that the majority of the companies assessed are not yet demonstrating the efforts that we look for towards a just transition. So only 9 of the 180 companies assessed scored above 50% of the points available in the assessment. And you see here some key figures. we saw that demonstration for advocacy was particularly low, which is understandable. We do see that there's a sort of potentially sequential movement through those steps around stakeholder engagement and social dialogue planning, and then moving towards maturity for advocacy. But we do also highlight these fundamentals around the human rights due diligence piece as well, and that only 12 of the 180 companies are demonstrating the basics on that. So we really here to serve and intend that all of our results and our methodologies can act as roadmaps as well for companies to understand what to do in order to make sure that they're demonstrating these fundamentals on human rights and just transition. So it's my last slide and looking ahead, and a big part of our work is also gathering sort of stakeholder action around this. So we see that the assessment that we did last year and the assessments we will do moving forward, we're really trying to fill that data gap, provide the data to stakeholders, especially to investors and the companies themselves, so that there can be an understanding of why maybe greater accountability is needed and what action is needed. So I mentioned earlier that we'll integrate the Just Transition assessment into our whole climate and energy benchmark ranking going forward. So this year we assess transport companies, and then moving ahead through next year, we're going to look at the real estate and construction sector, then metals and mining, and then capital goods. We are still refining the exact selection of companies in those sectors, but we'll always be endeavouring to publish up-to-date lists on our website when available. And just to re-emphasise here, indeed, the methodology is a common tool and roadmap that's really available. So we hope to indeed inform better understanding of what is needed. And then finally, very happy to announce that today we actually launched our first action around what we call our Collective Impact Coalition. So this first Collective Impact Coalition, as we call it, multi-stakeholder movement, is focused on some investor allies that we have, working on writing to companies in the oil and gas sector and explaining what more they would seek to be done on just transition there. So that's all from me, but very happy to I think maybe we move into questions.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Thank you. So I'm not sure if those in the room, if you had followed this, but it's really very impactful what the World Benchmarking Alliance did. They ranked companies based on their pathway to the Paris Agreement, like, oh, great, really moving forward in this transition. And then they ranked the same companies on human rights and just transition, and there was no correlation. It wasn't that you were doing really well on the pathway to green that you were going to do well on human rights. Actually, sometimes the opposite. You just weren't really paying attention to that. So the fact that they had these different benchmarks and they bring them together was a way to show to companies, great that you're moving towards in this pathway to the green and the Paris Agreement, but do it in a way that brings people along. So thank you so much, Charlotte. We'll be leaving the virtual speakers right now and moving to our in-person speakers. So let me invite my fellow speakers to join me over here on the panel. All right, we envision this as a sort of fireside chat to end the day. Susannah, move forward.
Oh, I didn't realize there was an extra space. Do you want to move on?
Yeah, sure.
Great. All right, so you've got the titles of everyone that is on our fireside chat ahead of you, so I won't go into the details here, but let's delve right into it. And we envision this as a discussion amongst us a little bit, and then we will open it up to questions or comments from you, so please do prepare them if you have any. Ben, let me hand over to you first. You're policy advisor at the OECD Centre for Responsible Business Conduct. You've been doing a lot of work on exploring the interconnections between the E of environmental due diligence and the HR of human rights due diligence. And in particular now you're working on a new environmental due diligence guidance. Can you share a little bit more how you see the interconnections, what's been coming up for you?
Sure, thanks so much, Anna. Yeah, I mean, while at the Center for Responsible Business Conduct at the OECD, we have been working on environmental risks as a fundamental part of the scope of the M&E guidelines and also the horizontal due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct for some time. I think anyone here very familiar with our standards in the mining sector will have noticed that environmental risks aren't explicitly referenced as part of the scope of our minerals due diligence guidance. And so that's something that we're working on trying to bridge now. I think for many years, we have felt that given the very supply chain specific, in terms of the mineral supply chain specific kind of lens of the due diligence guidance for responsible mineral supply chains on the one hand, and with our horizontal instruments on the other, we have had a framework in conjunction with other international instruments to address environmental risks, but along with other risks that do fall outside the explicit scope, the risk scope of the minerals guidance, and especially given the salient environmental risks that do exist in the mining sector, we felt that it was overdue at least to address this area in terms of environmental risks, specifically in the mining sector, more head on. And one of the ways that this has come to our attention actually was through some research that we conducted last year on third-party risk reporting trends. And what this report and the research highlighted was what we did was actually with Assheton's team's help is we compiled third-party risk reports across different risks covered by the M&E guidelines and the minerals due diligence. And what really came through, at least for me, was these interconnections, as you say, Anna, that for a long time, especially with conflict financing and conflict minerals having been the impetus for the minerals guidance, a lot of companies and to some extent policymakers as well had been looking at minerals due diligence with somewhat of tunnel vision, whether it was conflict financing or child labor, without seeing how those risks were interconnected and interlinked, let alone with environmental risks. And so what came through that research was actually how a lot of environmental risks and environmental impacts on communities quickly evolve and degenerate into human rights abuses, and are also tied to corruption issues in terms of efforts to conceal environmental risks and prevent any accountability from being achieved. And we actually only see this risk growing. So especially with the advent of the critical minerals narrative and the linkages between the fact that we really need all sources of critical minerals to come online, in order to meet the goals of the low carbon transition. We can't de-risk, we can't walk away, particularly as Mr. Chipanda kind of put into perspective in terms of what the stakes are. So we really see there being this nexus between a reliable and a responsible sourcing framework when it comes to critical minerals, when it comes to minerals at large, and that's really essential for fostering the just transition. Since we can't walk away, and we need to stay engaged both in what are currently either low governance or high emissions jurisdictions, or both. And we do need to exercise due diligence, including environmental due diligence, in order to see those risks off. And that includes the informal sector. Also, as the advisor mentioned, of course, it's an employment engine, and instead of simply avoiding the risk, we need to actually transform that part of the supply chain and other distressed segments of supply chains through due diligence. So.
Thank you. Fascinating how you're seeing those interconnections come up. I was on a panel recently with someone, I'll steal this from my fellow panelists there, who said, well, we specialize for a reason between the environmental side, the climate side, human side, social side to progress, but now we're shooting ourselves in the foot. And you're seeing this come up, and a really fantastic example there that you highlighted. Assheton, let me hand to you. So you're CEO of TDI Sustainability and obviously have a wealth of expertise in the cobalt sector and other minerals. We heard from the external speakers how they see the just transition from an external perspective. How do you see it? How do you see the term applied to the cobalt sector?
Thanks, Anne. And also I should note your wisdom in allocating 4 minutes each to the speeches. It's made me concentrate my comments into 4 points, which I'll make, allocating 1 minute to each, if that's okay. And I'm speaking today as the Executive Director of the Fair Cobalt Alliance, which is an alliance of companies and civil society, which is really kind of part of making change on the ground in the cobalt mining fields of Lualaba. maybe for my first one, I just kind of reflect on the term transition. I know more educated people than I have just defined that specifically, but I guess I'm more familiar with it in the past when it's associated with sunset industries. Of course, what we've heard today is that cobalt isn't a sunset industry. In fact, it's far from that if we are to follow the predictions of the market soothsayers. But the sentiment, I think, has parallels, and essentially the just transition is saying that we, as economies transition, we shouldn't leave people behind. And we should take heed, I think, from some of these sunset industries where that has happened, often triggered by enforced regulation, itself triggered by international conventions. Take, for example, the Montreal Convention and the CFCs, which successfully eliminated ozones and eliminated CFCs and closed a hole in the ozone, but at the same time had ramifications for the Indian economy, for example. Those of you who, like me, lived through the Thatcher years in the UK can remember the closure of coal mines and the heat of resistance that was met with people who felt they were going to lose their jobs, and we feel that or the echoes of that as I go from the United States to other parts of the OECD countries as well, where coal mines are closing. So we've got to be careful, I think, not to, in our eagerness to transition to a clean and green economy, that we figure out who's going to be left out, who's going to be the losers of this. So sustainable development is about people as well. So that brings me to the second point, really, is so whose lives will be affected? Well, the Fair Cobalt Alliance, we started because we knew that the demand for and price of cobalt, as we've been hearing today, is rising, and that is going to be sustained. This interest is from the input materials for this greener and cleaner economy, but also for responsibly produced materials. And responsibly produced materials also includes that are respectful of human rights. So our work focuses on the artisanal miners in the cobalt mining area in the DRC, because these are the ones which are threatened to be left behind in this transition if we're not cognizant of it and take action. So, some numbers, ASM accounts for about 20% or 15 to 20%, as we heard from the special advisor today. That could rise considerably as prices rise. But that's the production. And people, if we talk about the people whose rights might be affected, it's about 300,000 people directly, over another million indirectly who are affected by this. To put that in perspective, that 300,000 figure is about the same number that the top 5 largest global mining companies employ. So ASM employs a lot of people in relation to the large-scale industrial mining sector. So we're concerned at the FCA that the artisanal mining sector will be left behind. Why are we concerned? Because the narrative that we continue to hear from articles written puts the ASM in a bad light, in an intractable situation where it's associated and linked with dire social and environmental issues, and I'll talk a little about that in a second. But in standards and in regulation, it's almost categorically classified as a high-risk, no-go area without any kind of nuance about it. So what needs to change? Well, first we need to acknowledge that artisanal mining of cobalt is here to stay, and I think that's been reinforced today by other speakers. But also that it needs to be, therefore, a legitimate sector, a legitimate segment in the cobalt supply chain. So what then needs to be done to make the artisanal mining of cobalt legitimate? Well, of course, the conditions of many artisanal miners in Lualaba are very grave. Everyone acknowledges that. The safety record is dire. The pay is low. The pay for women is subsistence level, and there is no long-term security. However, our view in the Fair Cobalt Alliance and our experience in other parts of the world that this isn't intractable, this is not just the way it is, but it can be improved, and in many cases it has already been improved. So how do we go about improving it? And really there's kind of 4 things that we look at. The first one is the formalization of a sector. And again, we heard that very good and laudable remarks from the special advisor today that the government is taking the lead in establishing the appropriate standard for the practices and the formalization of that sector and beefing up its agencies to oversee the trading of the cobalt minerals as well. This is very welcome, and we will continue to support the DRC government to put that in place, as they must, of course, be the lead in that. But also we need to look at the artisanal miners and the cooperatives themselves and their practices need help in professionalization. So the second part of our strategy is to invest into technical assistance and capacity development to enable that they can, in fact, meet the expectations of the market for responsible production, and this is just. Another one is fair markets. The third one is fair markets, access to fair markets. And that means greater transparency. One of the things that plagues the artisanal cobalt miners in Lualaba, in the DRC, is that they don't have a view on what these prices are, or what the industrial, or what the market prices are globally. So we got to build greater transparency in there as well. And the fourth, which is really something we're very kind of passionate about, is that we need to invest in the capital equipment and the capital of these small-scale mines. You know, we've heard today that mining needs investment, cobalt mining needs investment, not just the recycling, not just the processing, but the mining itself. Well, artisanal miners are no different. They also need access to productive equipment. They need access to mine planning. They need access to infrastructure, and they need access to people who have the requisite skills to professionalize their institutions. So this is the key goal. And then finally, and my last 4th minute, it's really how then do we bring this about? So about 2 decades ago, I think it might have been, Amnesty International published something called Human Rights, Whose Business Is It? And so the question here is, whose business is it to ensure that the transition into this green economy is just for the artisanal miners on who we are going to increasingly rely for the swing sources of cobalt onto the market. And the conclusions of the Amnesty report then, I think, stand true today, that it is the role of businesses, responsibility of business to do this. And so what we've established at the Fair Cobalt Alliance is a collaboration between companies upstream, so those miners like Glencore and CMOC, and those downstream, so those like Tesla and Google, who collectively pool their resources to enable the progress made along those 4 different strategies that I articulated then. So I think in the just transition, I think it's all about taking action on the ground and ensuring that these the rights are respected of those communities that we need to include.
Thanks so much, Assheton. I'm really looking at, with the Fair Cobalt Alliance, really looking at tackling the root cause of the impacts, which, for those who are following the laws, the new EU law that is being discussed, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, that's what it's about. Let's lean in and tackle these issues, and the Fair Cobalt Alliance is a fantastic example of that. Susannah, let's move to you from an industry association perspective. You've been delving into the concept of just transition. What does it mean for the cobalt sector? What does it mean for your members? You've also done a full value chain assessment last year. Can you share a bit more what you've learned?
Yes, thank you. And I'd just like to say on behalf of the Cobalt Institute how delighted we are and excited that we're hosting this session together today, together with Anna, who has really, I'm sure you'll agree, has carefully curated the selection of the panel and particularly the introductory speeches to really set the scene for what a just transition means. And now as the cobalt industry, our challenge is to take that and really help and support our membership and our industry, so beyond our membership, to understand what it means for our sector. And in a sense, we feel as if we are the custodians of this concept for and on behalf of the industry, and we're looking forward to working with everyone to figure out what this means. And I'd also say I prepared a few remarks sort of stating the case for Cobalt's contribution to a net zero economy and how important it is in the role in the green transition. But those remarks have already been made, and I think that case is, a moot point now, so I can move on from that. Really to reflect on particularly the interventions earlier in this session, where it's clear that cobalt is a commodity that is strategic and critical to the green transition, but it does not essentially mean that by default it would lead to a just transition. And therefore, as an industry, we need to be accountable to the impacts that we have on people and the planet. And that's where we bring this conversation to, and that's why we're speaking about this concept today. So what really is the role of the Cobalt Institute in ensuring a just and green transition? And I mean that really at a practical level, not just about talking, but what can we do concretely? So we see ourselves very much as an industry association, as staying ahead, one step ahead of the curve to help the industry figure out what's the next big issue. And whilst just transition is embedded in the Paris Agreement, it really is only now that people are stepping up to that discussion. And we paid more attention to what was going on in the lead up to COP26. And together with Anna, who's been supporting us at the Cobalt Institute for a while on implementing the UN Guiding Principles, we decided it was time to put our mark and to start to say something ourselves. And so we published a blog, myself, Anna, and Tom Fairley, our sustainability manager, who's in the room today as well, calling for a just transition that extends beyond workers to also encompass community members along the value chain, and to ensure that environmental policy making integrates human rights considerations in alignment with the international frameworks. This also built on the work that Anna mentioned, the Cobalt value chain analysis that we undertook last year, where we mapped the industry's most salient environmental and human rights risks. That work is available on our website, and we've received very positive feedback on that, and we use it very much to inform our analysis. But really what that analysis showed is that a just transition needs to happen by addressing all the risks to people and planet across the value chain. There is a lot of focus on the impacts related to artisanal mining in the cobalt sector, and rightly so, and it needs to change, and we are working to address that. But that shouldn't leave all other elements of the value chain sort of feeling free, as if, okay, the focus is there, so I can just get on with my business. We all need to play a role, whether we're in the upstream, whether in refining and smelting, whether we're in manufacturing or in the downstream through the use of our products. And that's what we're trying to figure out. And what we're doing to do that, we have, in March, we didn't make a public splash about this, but our members are well aware and very engaged. We launched the Cobalt Environment, Human Rights and Just Transition Learning Group, which is essentially a peer learning group where we will be supporting our membership to figure out really what does the just transition and what does bringing the environmental and human rights due diligence agenda together mean for the cobalt industry. And how do we translate that and make that meaningful to the stakeholders? And what we soon realized was that our industry was not talking about it as a just transition, but that doesn't mean it wasn't front of mind. It is referred to as an equitable transition. You'll see we sort of compromised on the opening name of our session, really to make sure that anyone who wasn't looking at it as a just transition, but as an equitable and green transition, could also join in that dialogue. So that's a group that actually we're actually convening straight after this conference here in Zurich, together with 11 of our member companies, and with the support of Anna at Hugman level and her team, to really start that discussion and understand and figure out how to be more meaningful in our due diligence and how to engage in more meaningful stakeholder engagement, how to think about effective grievance mechanisms, and what is the role for remedy and what can we do about it. And more importantly, where do we use how can we build collective leverage as a sector to address these challenging issues and to bring about a just and green transition. So in conclusion, I'd like to say that this panel is really our public kickoff of this debate. We will be making this available, this recording, in the public domain, and we will be speaking about it. We really see it as our contribution for Cobalt to the minerals sector, to bring the rest of the minerals sector along with us. I know that Anna and her team will be taking notes and issuing key learnings from this sector and from this session. And I also want to note that alongside all this work for our industry, we are engaging on the very challenging and pressing issues related to artisanal mining. We are members of the Fair Cobalt Alliance that Assheton mentioned earlier. We engage very strongly with the OECD and the Responsible Business Alliance to ensure that this filters through practices on standards. And we are, of course, engaged and willing to support the governments of the Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia to support their efforts to really bring value to their countries and to ensure that their people are benefiting from the minerals that hopefully will help bring us to net zero. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Susannah. Anna, let's hand over to you. Anna Stancher, you are RMI Project Manager at the Responsible Business Alliance, and you've recently undertaken a revision with the copper mark of your risk readiness assessment. I understand interconnections came up. Can you share a bit more?
Indeed. Well, thank you, Anna, and first of all, thanks to the Cobalt Institute for the invitation to speak today, to Susannah and to her team for preparing and setting up this panel. It is for us at the RMI and for myself in particular an opportunity to share, but also really an opportunity to learn from the fellow speakers and from the public at large. So thanks for this. I will be speaking to you really as a practitioner, bringing a very concrete example of how we have seen the concept, the thematic issues that are related to the just transition that we have heard today from this morning into the panels of the afternoon, how we have seen them reverberate into the revision of one of the key tools that we put at avail of our members to undertake risk assessment in their supply chains. And short word of introduction, the risk readiness assessment is an assessment tools that company in any mineral or metal supply chain can use to evaluate and demonstrate their performance on a number of issues that are related to environmental protection, to human rights, worker rights, to governance. So if we want to sum it up on the ESG side of things. And starting last year, together with the Copper Mark that manages the tool with us, and with the support of Assheton and his team, we have started a process of stock taking. Stock taking in terms of how the tool has been used so far, but also what the expectations of the industry that we represent, and also of external stakeholders, civil society representative, industry experts. So the expectations that a broad range of stakeholders have on how the industry is managing its environmental risks and performance, the social risk and performance, and governance aspects. And we didn't set off wanting to align to the just transition. As Susannah said, I can only echo that the just transition framework is becoming a buzzword, but it hasn't been there for long yet in our space. So our intention was really to look at where is the bar moving, how are the expectations evolving, and also where is legislation driving those expectations. But in the process of doing so, we clearly recognized the emergence of some aspects that we found very much in the discussion on the just transition. And I will share a few takeaways and a few learning with you that relate to the environmental side of things, to the social side of things, and then maybe most interesting, to the nexus that we have seen emerging between the ES and the S. So if we take the environmental pillar first, and we have seen a push from the industry and from stakeholders themselves to really incorporate climate action expectations within this risk assessment tool. Climate action meaning a comprehensive integrated strategy to manage the climate mitigation and climate adaptation measures of a company, and that serves as a direction to also inform and shape the measures that a company is taking within their operations and within their supply chain to manage climate-related risks. And one element that really came up strong there is alignment with the Paris Agreement and with the temperature, the increased scenarios that are outlined there. And this meant then a direct trickle down to the GHG emission reduction expectations, where in the past we used to speak about GHG targets per se, so having targets was already a good thing, but now we're really looking at science-based targets that are aligned with the Paris Agreement. So in a way, the bar is shifting there. We've also seen that there is an additional reverberation of that, of the climate action element, which also informs the measures that a company is expected to take in other related environmental areas. Let's think about water management or biodiversity management, and there is really more the climate adaptation angle, which is coming in. So we have seen really climate rising at the forefront of the environmental chapter of the risk assessment. And yeah, I don't think I need to explain how material that is given the conversation that took place this morning. So if I shift over to the social chapter, then that is where we really saw a strong call to mainstream the UNGP, and also for companies the desire to have guidelines and expectation against which they could demonstrate the efforts that they are making to respect broad spectrum of worker rights and human rights, so going beyond the OECD NS2 risks that we know from the responsible mineral sourcing guidelines of the OECD, and really looking at issues such as remuneration, working hours, occupational health and safety, freedom of association, collective bargaining, and broadening the scope of who is in the center of that. So we are not looking only at workers within the direct operations of a company within the facility, but also at risks that to which workers that are subcontractors or employed by business partners could be subjected to. And we have sort of crystallized that into the respect, prevent, and mitigate framework. And coming then to the final point, which would be related to the nexus between social and environment. So we have not only seen the environmental chapter and the social chapter raising sort of on equal footing, but also starting to talk to each other. And that comes out under, I would say, 3 specific items. One is a right holder approach, a right holder centered approach. The second one is stakeholder engagement, and the third one is grievance mechanism. I will say a few words to each of them.
Very briefly, Anna.
Very briefly. Okay, I'll try. So, right holders approach, I think we are used to hear of that in the realm of human rights and worker rights, but we start seeing that expectation come out also under the environmental chapters. For example, looking at how a company is using water, relying on water resourcing, and what the impact of that is on the local communities today and also in the future. Second element, stakeholder engagement. There is broad expectations that companies engage early in a continuous manner with stakeholders beyond workers, also local communities, not only on social matters, but also very much on environmental matters. And if risk materializes, flip side of the coin, grievance mechanism, there is a strong expectation that a grievance mechanism is available for affected parties to raise their concerns on social issues, but also on adverse environmental impacts, and for a company then to use that to kick off a process of remediation. I'm not saying we have it all done and crafted. I'm saying this has been really a learning journey, and we are opening this now for broader consultation again, so that we can really harvest more feedback to finalize this and make it available to the industry.
Very interesting. Thank you, Anna. Last but not least, Johannes. Johannes, Danz, you are project coordinator for sustainable supply chains in human rights, supply chains and raw materials at Mercedes-Benz. You sit at a different part of the value chain than a number of players in the room today. How do you see it from your perspective, this concept of just transition?
Yeah, it's a massive term, obviously, and there's only so much you can do in 4 minutes, so forgive me if I'm just trying to pick on a few things and not really going into any depth here. Apologies. First and foremost, I think we need to acknowledge that at least from a management perspective, CO2 will remain a bit of an independent issue going forward. And that just has to do with the implementation of really driving the process towards net zero, with specific targets that are based on specific minerals or products. And that is just how that entire process is being driven forward. But it is, of course, not the end of the game. We are seeing at the same time that there's an increased awareness of due diligence thinking in general, of course, with a tendency to think of human rights in most cases. And that's something that we appreciate quite a lot, because that really changes things. Usually there's this notion out there that this is just, a bit of fresh paint on top of something that we've been doing forever. I don't think that's the case, because putting the affected rights holder in the center of the attention, that really means that you're doing a risk analysis differently, you will define your measures differently. And that is just a very different approach, and that also leads to different outcomes. So we are very happy to see that more strongly reflected in the debate, and also, and I want to point this out quite clearly, in regulation. Mercedes-Benz has been one of the early proponents of the German Supply Chain Act, but also also in relation to the initiative on the European level. We believe that's quite important to bring a certain level playing field to the game and to really onboard the entire supply chain when it comes to implement that due diligence thinking. And then, of course, the largest dynamic currently is with Ben, and that is carrying that due diligence thinking that we know so well from the UNGP background towards issues of the environment, and therefore the OECD process, we believe, is quite an important element. Interesting stuff coming out of that already. The German Environment Agency has just a few days ago published a new study, which is part of the process, I believe, on environmental issues in automotive raw material supply chain. So a lot of stuff happening in that context, and we are absolutely curious to see how this will unfold until the end of the year. And then finally, because I think my role here is a bit to also share the OEM viewpoint on a few things in terms of what you can expect, what might change in the future. Just 3 super quick points. One is, I believe that we will see a lot more direct exchange, direct engagement from OEMs with the risk hotspots in the supply chain. Very often, that is the mining level, of course, and I see that there will be a lot more engagement compared to what we've seen in recent years already. Second point, we will see quite a lot of introduction of really robust requirements in terms of prerequisites to awardings that respond to some of these risks that have come out of risk analysis, both environmental and social and human rights. It is no secret that just to give an example, that at Mercedes-Benz we're promoting IHRB as a mining standard that in our view ticks a lot of boxes when it comes to these mining risks that are very difficult to access from an OEM's perspective, because we are just very far away from it. So we need something that really addresses that technical mining level on the ground, and also therefore also the risks that are associated with it. And then finally, I believe that we will see a reflection of that debate being implemented one step at a time, of course, but in the standard contracting that OEMs will offer. And then, of course, that will be passed through the supply chain over time. I can't say too much about this today in terms of details, but there will be a major update, let's call it that way, at Mercedes-Benz in the second half of this year when it comes to that particular question. So that that due diligence thinking, both environmental and human rights focused, will have a place there and will play a bigger role in the warnings and contracting in the time to come.
Thank you. So some suspense here, something to be followed in a few months' time. All right, we have a few minutes left while we wrap up. I want to open it up to questions. We'll take a few if there are any. If you have any, please raise your hands. Yep, gentleman over here. I don't know if there's a mic. And if there's any other, we'll take one other question after this, gentleman. Great.
Oh, hello, Nick Niarchos. I'm a journalist. The story around ASM has been going on for quite a long time. What do you think historically have been the issues around creating a sort of fair supply chain with regards to ASM? And what do you think the current obstacles are on the ground?
Thank you. And let's take the question from Tom at the same time. We'll take a third one, and then the panelists can each respond briefly to the questions. Tom is just in the middle here. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Anna. Tom Fairley, Sustainability Manager at the Cobalt Institute. There's been a focus today on upstream and just transition, and I was just wondering if there's any reflections on what just transition might look at other stages in the value chain as well.
Great, great. And then the lady right at the back here. Perfect.
Hi, Abby Rowan from Ruud Pedersen Public Affairs. A quick question or perhaps challenge to Johannes. You mentioned that CO2 will remain separate, have its own targets, but just a question, perhaps if more social and environmental considerations were tied to those CO2 targets, then we'd be better at achieving them. Thanks.
I think we have another question over this gentleman, and what we'll do is we'll really just 3 sentences response from the panelists. Maybe a little bit more, a few more.
Andrew Gully, USGS. So I'm wondering, when you have estimates of how much artisanal production is of the DRC, where do those estimates typically come from?
All right, Susannah. If you have either a closing remark or something you would like to respond to one of the questions.
Okay, I think colleagues on this panel, we have a couple of colleagues better placed to address the ASM question. So I'd like to respond to Tom's question, because it's one that's important to the Cobalt Institute in terms of looking at this from a value chain approach, and ensuring that whilst it's very important that the upstream is playing its role in the just transition, we mustn't forget, for instance, that a big proportion of cobalt goes through other countries, particularly China. So the smelting and refining and the practices there need to bring that just transition along. And then whilst you move to, and then as we move further, then you have different challenges in other parts of the world. We mustn't, be fooled to think that it's only in what are commonly termed as CARAs that issues occur. So it's still a work in progress. This is what this conversation is about, also to figure out, to support every company in the value chain to understand what it means for them and how they can respond.
Thank you. Johannes. We'll just go in the order. Johannes.
Yeah. Okay. Let me actually spend my 3 sentences on the question from the back. So what I meant by saying it will stay the same roughly is rather in the context of a product level, because that really comes with quantitative targets of a reduction flow over time. So it's more. The comment was more based on a methodology and how to approach it, really, and I think that will stay the same. It has certainly, the introduction of battery vehicles has certainly changed our prioritization as to which materials in general we regard as risky, and therefore place our emphasis, our attention on. And that also has a human rights component, for instance. So there's, it's just a different playing field. I guess that's the point.
Great, Ben.
Maybe I'll take a stab at the first question on ASM. I think, a lot of us in this world have sort of it feels like a lot of deja vu sometimes in terms of dealing with the issue and how we kind of go around in circles. But I think, not only in Cobalt, but really ASM, promoting responsible engagement of ASM around the world in every supply chain where it exists has just been a huge undertaking in terms of raising awareness and education of companies. And I think part of that stems from companies approaching due diligence initially from sort of a binary compliance perspective, where things are either good or bad. You avoid bad, risky things, and you want to embrace sort of positive, value-promoting issues from the standpoint of the company, and moving to a mindset where it's more about good faith, progressive improvement, and responsible engagement in high-risk areas. That's just been a really difficult task, and that's been compounded by the fact that around the world in many contexts there aren't clear legal frameworks for ASM, and that's why in the due diligence guidance and across our instruments we promote a framework of legitimacy. So dealing with actors, including in the informal sector, that may be poorly regulated but demonstrate good faith to try to formalize, and that's something that where we still have some work to do, but I think based on everything we've heard at the conference, there has been kind of a shift and a sea change when it comes to recognizing the role of ASM, its role in markets, as well as its role in livelihoods.
Thank you. Assheton.
I'll give you a combination of 5 things, each of which I think we're moving forward to address, as some of my remarks had talked about today. So the first one is formalization, and the DRC government spoke to that today, and the importance of putting in place a formalized structure. And Ben's point is absolutely clear. That will then enable a understanding of the market of what is legitimate. And legitimacy, I think, is actually a key word. So we have to work with that concept of legitimacy, not relying only on rules. But having said that, the second one then is having a standard, which is a market access standard, and we're moving towards that. We've already built the ASM Cobalt framework, which is in consultation, and the DRC government has its EGC draft standard. So those must come together, and we will continue to do that. The third is investing in change. So we can have standards and we can have frameworks, but we've actually got to invest in implementing those standards, and that's what we must drive to do. And we are trying to do that too. The fourth, I think, is complexity of the supply chain, and the idea that we have to have direct sourcing, direct point of source. And this, I think, is not going to work for ASM, nor should we expect it, because even though it is 10 to 20%, it's highly dispersed amongst many thousands of different people. So instead, we should look to reward good practices in ASM through what is called a book and claim system. So enabled to recognize the amount of cobalt you buy, but then also put an equivalent amount of money linked to a credit into the investments on the ground. And then last is collaboration. This is only going to happen if the different stakeholders who have an interest and a sincere commitment to securing long-term change come together and put these things on paper and make the commitments to make them happen.
Thanks, Assheton. Anna, close us out.
Thanks, Anna. So I will just close the loop, circling back to the point that Susannah was making on the question related to downstream and what the expectations for downstream are. I think we spoke a lot about expectations on upstream, midstream of the supply chain, but we shouldn't forget that same expectations actually apply to downstream players. And we at RMI, and I'm sure we are not the only actor here, are looking at the supply chain from upstream to downstream, and there is a similar evolution in terms of environmental and social expectations coming together. The next element that I think would be a challenge that needs to be woven into due diligence is how do we move from looking at company operation in the supply chain to how do we look at the full value chain perspective. So embedding due diligence measures that not only look upstream, but also that look at downstream. And there is where focuses start being concentrated, and I think we need more guidance and more thinking from that point of view.
Thank you very much, Anna. And that's an excellent way to close this session. Discussion to be continued. I'd like to thank our speakers, those that are with us today, those that joined us virtually, and all of you for staying with us today. And we will continue the discussion, but for now I will hand over to Adam McCarthy to close out our conference today. Thank you very much.
So I guess I'll just stand here rather than move backwards and forwards. So I think that brings us to the end of the first day of the conference. I think we've certainly heard a lot. We've heard ambition from the DRC, from Zambia, but we've also heard the ambition to make that change a just transition. So I think today's panel really crowned a lot of the discussions we've been having so far today. So tomorrow we start again at 9:30. We will have contributions from again from the DRC, from the United States government, and then we'll have a discussion on the circular economy and the recyclability of cobalt and how that also contributes to that general transition with the metal.